This episode is sponsored by the Bridge to Recovery, a nonprofit program on 115 acres near Bowling Green, Kentucky, a tranquil place where they've been changing lives for over 40 years. Their people improve their quality of life by acknowledging past emotional wounds and healing from all forms of trauma. The CEO, Paul Hamlin, has been a friend of mine for 20 years. Call him directly at 858-945-7848. That's 858-945-7848, or you can learn more about the Bridge to Recovery by clicking the link in the show notes or visiting thebridgetorovery.com. Thank you for listening to The Path to Authenticity. My name's Tom Gentry. I think of this show as the opposite of small talk. You'll hear real conversations with real people who know who they are. We talk about what makes them who they are, how they became who they are, and how we might become truer expressions of who we are.
I am Joshua Shea, and this is The Path to Authenticity.
Tom Gentry. Thanks for listening to The Path to Authenticity. This episode features a conversation with an author named Joshua Shea. He is a recovering pornography addict and an expert on pornography addiction, which, if you don't know, it's pretty rampant right now, and there aren't that many advocates out there talking about it. It's just one of those things that is highly stigmatized. And there's a stigma in general when it comes to addiction, alcoholism, drug abuse. But man, nobody wants to talk about pornography. And, as much as I try to be as authentic as I possibly can on this show, being what it is, the path to authenticity, I found myself, as time was ticking by and this conversation was getting closer, saying to myself, man, I hope we don't end up talking about my relationship with pornography. And, I've never really even been into porn, but it's just, obviously, we're all exposed to it at some time or another. And man, it's I don't want to talk about it. Not personally. So it takes an awful lot of courage to do what Josh was doing. I can't even imagine. And, I think it was a great topic and a great conversation, and he's definitely a resource out there for anyone who needs it, either people who are suffering with it or because of it. A lot of times we think of it as a male problem, and a lot of times it's wives, girlfriends who are affected by it. But it's a real problem in our culture right now. So here you go. Hope you enjoy it. Joshua Shea.
Just the product of some bad seeds.
Joshua, thank you so much for coming on The Path to Authenticity. I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Well, and I appreciate the time to be able to share my story. It's still a tough thing to get people to talk about, so it takes two to tango. So, thank you very much.
You're welcome. And, in our correspondence, as we planned on doing this, and I kind of talked to you about what I'm focused on and the angle from which I wanted to come. I'm interested Well, obviously the show is about personal authenticity, and I'm interested in talking about your ideas about how pornography and pornography addiction sort of eclipsed your true self, how you think that plays a role in the culture at large, how it affects men from a men's issues perspective, how it affects the dynamics and relationships. And one, as a guy who, I mean, we're probably about the same age. You know, I was born in 73, so grew up in the 80s, graduated from high school at the very beginning of the 90s. You know, for me as a little kid, pornography was a magazine or a VHS tape at somebody's house that you watched when the parents weren't home and you better not get caught. You know, so it was just the access to it has changed so much. Even with the advent of the internet, it exploded at the beginning of it, but it's increased so much that now just use of pornography is just so pervasive in our culture. Like it's just such a part of our culture now that it never was before, and it's kind of baffling when you really think about how different things were 30 years ago. It's changed a lot, right?
Oh, it absolutely has. And the big changes, like you mentioned, number one is access. I was born in 76, so we're of the same, age group. I was first hooked on magazines, and, it was a great day when I found that video store that would rent a 14-year-old kid adult tapes.
Right.
And the access is what is so different now, because essentially everybody with a telephone from age 10 to 95 has the greatest pornography computer ever made in their pocket right now.
Right.
And it can also, the stuff that you and I could find on a magazine at the 7-Eleven or a videotape at the local video store, that stuff is pretty vanilla compared to the kind of content you can get these days. There's an itch to be scratched for every proclivity out there, and if you want to see the most deranged stuff, you can find it, and that wasn't the case when you and I were coming up.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that if you look at statistics around demographics that are reporting the biggest jumps in pornography addiction, you're seeing groups like women and black men and Catholic and LDS, because for the first time, this access is available. Not only is the access available, but the content is being pushed towards these different groups. When you and I were younger, 85-90% of the magazines and videos were designed for your straight white male.
Right.
And, women and people who enjoyed something other than, quote unquote, middle of the road vanilla sex, couldn't really find what they were looking for, and didn't want to be found out. It was one thing for a guy. It was one thing for a guy to be coming out of an adult video store, in 1990. It was another thing for a woman to be coming out of it.
Right.
And I think that this ease of access, plus you've got these niche creators of content these days that go after the very small audiences or go after some of the demographics that weren't sought after before. So now you're kind of seeing an evening out across all types of people, where that didn't happen with pornography before.
So you've written a couple books. Mm-hmm. And you've been really outspoken about your own experience with pornography addiction. How do you spend a typical day?
Now I spend a typical day usually maintaining my website, which is recoveringpornaddict.com, answering any emails people have sent me. If I'm working on a book project or some other kind of project, I usually spend the mornings working on that after I've brought my son to school, and taking care of the many pets we have. And then in the afternoon, I have to actually, make a living because the pornography education part of my life isn't making money for me right now. So I work as a ghostwriter for people, a lot of corporate books, a lot of how-to books, and a lot of people who want their biographies or autobiographies written, I should say. So that's how I pay my bills in the during the afternoon, and then at night, I try to carve out time for my family, spend time with them, because for so many years when I was locked into my addiction of not only pornography, but I was an alcoholic as well, I didn't give my family the kind of time they deserved. So now even if it's only 30 minutes a day, I try to make sure that I'm present and I'm there for them.
That's great. Well, and that's really, for me, and I'm a recovering alcoholic myself, what I've come to learn more and more is what I was seeking with that relationship with alcohol. And I dabbled in some other things too, mostly pot and stuff, but it was connection. It was, I was looking for a type of connection that I didn't have, which ultimately was with myself. That's the connection that was really missing. But yeah, that's kind of the point of making this life transition, so that you can connect and you can be there for the people you love. And so I definitely honor you for that. And I think porn addiction, or even, I don't know, is there, like, in the addiction world these days, the way they're describing it is substance abuse, substance use disorder, substance dependence. Is there like an abuse version of porn addiction? Is there how do you look at that?
Well,
Do you see
I
a
look
moderate version of it, or what's your take on the whole big picture of it?
Well, to me, number one, it's really all labels. Whatever I label you, you're still the same guy you were 10 minutes ago.
Right.
And it's really about how it's affecting your life and how it's affecting your relationships with others.
Right.
But when it comes to addiction, addiction is addiction. And I truly believe that because, when I discovered pornography, when I discovered drinking, I had the same things going on. I felt the same ways. I used them for the same reasons.
Right.
They fixed the same problems.
Mm-hmm.
With addiction, it's ultimately taking part in a behavior or using a substance that, despite understanding the negative repercussions that very well may come, you cannot stop yourself.
Right.
Despite making deals with yourself to stop using, you
Right.
cannot. And it's really about the negativity that it creates in your life.
Right.
To me, that's the addiction right there. It's the nonstop search for that little flick of dopamine and oxytocin and getting your pleasure center hit, because that's the way you cope with something. Because
Right.
ultimately, addiction is usually just a symptom of something else.
Right.
Most of the time, that's a trauma from earlier in life.
That's exactly what I was getting at. I wanted to gauge from you what perspective you come from, because, I definitely, and I've worked in the substance abuse treatment industry for a long, long time. And that's kind of, I look at it like, okay, so there may or may not be a gene. I don't know. If there is, I probably have it. But I wasn't drinking the way I was as early as I was because everything was okay. And, it was a way for me to deal with things. It was a symptom of something else. And I agree with you. I have a friend who just released a book. She's a therapist. It's called Exiting the Maze. And it's about addiction. It's just kind of a step back where, we have to stop being so focused on the particular substance or behavior and realize that there's healing that needs to take place underneath all that. And there really is only one addiction.
Yeah, absolutely. And it frustrates me when I talk to people of science who, are like, well, we don't believe that the exact same thing happening in the brain is happening with, pornography or gambling as it does with an actual substance. We still need years of study before we're going to be able to consider this seriously. And it's just like, dude, I can shoot you or I can throw you off a cliff. Those are two very different things, but they come with the same ending. Do you really want to talk about the semantics of it? Because, you can get lost in the rationalization of the scientific method, but this is what's happening in front of you, and this is what's happening in front of us. And I don't care whether it's my alcoholism or my pornography. My life, was a mess, and I needed to deal with it. And those are the only two ways that I consistently found, from being a 14-year-old boy all the way up to being a 37, 38-year-old man before I entered recovery. I didn't care about parsing out the definitions. I didn't care about what the American Psychiatric Association had to say in their DSM at that point.
Right.
It's what's facing us and it's what's in front of us. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who, at high levels, who could help, but they get so lost in the academics of it that it's almost tragic.
Well, and what I'm with you on just how off track we get with managing this problem in our society, as the treatment industry. It's so frustrating to me at times, because just over the years, watching the different trends of the angles from which addiction is treated, the different ways to manage cravings and stuff like that, the different detox medications, detox versus maintenance, and then you can even get into, there are these factions that think, you shouldn't be sponsoring anyone unless you've been sober at least a year. And then the other faction that argues as soon as you finish the steps, you should start sponsoring. And it's all this energy used to argue about all these details, when why don't we talk about the problem? Why is it that as a culture we have the need to numb ourselves? Why don't we talk about that? Let's go layered. So, and that's actually part of why I'm doing this podcast, and it's about personal authenticity, because we're disconnected from ourselves. And I believe those of us who suffer from addictions, that's just how our distress expresses itself. The rest of us have other ways that it comes out. And granted, there's some of us who have better coping skills and are more emotionally grounded, more emotionally literate. But, we're not the healthiest society. We're really not. And I really do believe that addiction is just what I suffered with. Everybody has something,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm remembering the old VH1 show called Behind the Music.
Right.
And if you remember, it was a biography, very well done biography of a different musical star every week. And there was not a single happy episode. It was impossible to make a happy episode, and it didn't take very long, at least for me, to realize that if you were going to become a superstar musician at that level, there had to be largely something wrong with you, or something wrong with your background, or something so out of the ordinary happened to you that it left you with the need, with the drive to become this kind of famous person.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you. We all have these different things. There are people who are on the side of a cliff right now, climbing it with their bare hands, who think they're super healthy and they're loving life and engaging in it. And meanwhile, they're just ODing on the same pleasure chemicals that we went after with our addictions.
Right, right.
That's just as equally not healthy in some ways. Those stories usually end with, and Bob died doing what he loved best.
Right, right, right.
And it is one of these things where we are a world of injured people. We are a world of suffering people,
Right.
but nobody wants to go just beyond that top layer. I mean, I think that's part of, and I don't want to get into politics, but I think our nation is so divided because it's so much easier to just basically look at everything as sports, look at everything as, me versus you. And, and I don't think most people really care that deeply about that stuff. It just is a distraction from what's happening below the surface and dealing with some of the real demons people have.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also an expression of them, because if you look at the undercurrent of hostility that exists in this country right now, I mean, it's pretty astounding. It really is. It really, there's so much anger.
I was watching the beginning of the impeachment hearings. It was on the TV in a waiting room I was in, and they had this, very ceremonial way of doing things in the very beginning. And it was fascinating watching, because these are the two groups, the Democrats and Republicans, who go at each other's throat over everything. They want to kill each other over a coin flip. Right. And having to do these ceremonies with each other was fascinating to me, because they put this other stuff aside for a minute. And it just made me think, why can't they put their other stuff aside and do some good? Why can't the rest of us put this, stuff aside that's on the surface, that we deal with every day, that we use, in my life? Why couldn't I put the porn and the alcohol aside and deal with what was really there? I mean, it was 25 years of running to porn and alcohol to solve my problems, to run away from myself, to, try to cope with the world. I really should have just, tried to cope with the world and deal with what under the surface so much earlier.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think, in your particular circumstance, what was it that, happened in your world that kind of propelled you to look for something outside of yourself to change the way you feel?
Well, I don't think I was really specifically looking for it, because it happened when I was so young. I'm kind of textbook when it comes to a pornography addict, in that Dr. Patrick Carnes has said that 81% of porn and sex addicts have some kind of sexual abuse in their background, and 97% have some kind of emotional abuse.
Right.
And I had to deal with both of that at a babysitter's house that I went to. When my parents went to work when I was very young, before I started going to school, I was babysat during the day by a woman who I can look back now and recognize just how unhealthy she was, and just how good at, gaslighting the parents of the kids she took care of, that she was. But, I learned at a very young age, 3, 4, 5, at this place, to detach from what was happening around me. I learned some of my coping skills. I learned my big survival skill was just get through to the next day, do what you have to do, say what you have to say. It doesn't matter if you're lying, cheating, stealing. Just say and do what you have to do to survive till tomorrow, because tomorrow could be better, but you won't know unless you get there. So figure out a way to get there. And while that may be a suitable survival skill for a 5-year-old boy, it's not a workable survival skill for a 35-year-old
Right.
man with a family who's trying to run a business. And when, like I said, I discovered pornography or hardcore pornography about 11 years old, when an older cousin showed me some hardcore magazines. And then it was a couple years later when I was at a wedding reception that had far too much champagne at empty tables, that I got drunk for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And within a couple minutes of seeing the porn and within a couple minutes of feeling the buzz of the alcohol, I knew that I'd discovered something special. I knew that I had discovered something that probably would have got me through those days back at the babysitter easier.
Right.
And if it would have got me through those days easier, it was going to get me through the hard days ahead even easier.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like I just discovered this coping method. I just discovered this survival method. I just found this panacea for all of my problems in both the alcohol and the porn. And really, while my life radically changed multiple times over the next 25 years, those two things were always there for me. Whenever I needed to escape who I was or escape the anxiety or stress of the world around me.
So, at what point when did this become, you're in recovery from your alcoholism and from your pornography addiction? At what point do you realize I want to cross the line into advocacy?
It was very early on. Now, I've been a journalist since I was 17, 18 years old, and got a job when I was in high school at my local newspaper. I've been working in news or publishing since then. And when it was finally time to figure things out, especially with the pornography side of things, I went to the bookstore, and this was now 6 years ago now that I've been sober. I went to the bookstore, and there were a couple books about addiction. There was books about alcoholism, books about drug abuse. There was nothing at all about pornography addiction. And I think there was one book on sex addiction.
Probably Patrick Carnes.
I think it was, yeah. And I ended up, looking on the internet, and being the kind of person I am, I'm the kind of person who I like to read academic texts. I like to read studies, but I know the average person doesn't like to read that kind of stuff.
Right.
And at that point, I didn't want to read that kind of stuff. I just wanted to read about somebody who had been through what I'd been through. And there was nothing like that out there. So even though, I entered recovery in 2014, and I didn't start writing my first book until 2016, I knew very early on that I wanted to put something out there in case anybody was in my position in the future, that they would be able to find what I couldn't find. And what surprised me was after my first book came out in 2018, and that was about the time that I started my website as well, I started getting all kinds of messages and emails from the female partners of porn addicts. Right. And that I really didn't see that coming, but probably more than half of the messages I got were from, these women. And I realized, much like my wife had to enter this unknown world as the partner of a porn addict, the way I entered the world as trying to be a recovering porn addict, there were even fewer resources for the partners. So I made connections with an LMFT out of the Sacramento, California area. And we shared a story where I was always very leery of sharing, real medical advice or, telling people what to do, because I didn't have that experience. I didn't have that schooling. I just had my story and my experience and the people that I met in rehab and in group therapies and stuff, listening to their stories. But that's what I had, was people's stories. And what Tony, my co-author, mentioned to me was that, doing his couples therapy, working one-on-one with people with porn or sex addiction, what he would sometimes hear when they would get frustrated is, well, you don't know what I'm feeling because you've never been there, or you're not an addict.
Right.
You don't know what I'm talking about. So, in just brainstorming, he and I came to the conclusion that it was probably the best that we could offer, since we are not a woman who's been in that situation. The best that we could offer would be a simple, straightforward book where we explained things from the point of view of the expert, and we explained things from the point of view of the former addict, and tried to give that side of things to the partner who suddenly finds herself in a world she never thought she would.
Mm-hmm. Well, having worked with a lot of families over the years when it comes to addiction, and I think it really applies to any addiction, the spouse experiences a sense of betrayal because it's a relationship that their partner has with the pornography or the substance or whatever it is. It really is.
Right. Right. And you see this betrayal trauma happening far worse in cases of sex and porn addiction than you do in, say, heroin or gambling, because it's so tied to the intimate act of lovemaking. Usually a woman doesn't wonder, what did she do to cause him to go towards heroin?
Right.
Or is she not enough in the bedroom because his bets are escalating at the casino?
Right.
But because, sex, nudity, intercourse, intimacy are all intertwined with pornography, it's very easy for a partner, despite the fact that she had nothing to do to create the porn addiction, and it really has nothing to do with her, it's very easy for her to feel it's all about her.
Right. Right. And, it creates the pornography addiction in married couples. And it just creates this isolation between the two partners that, I've just people out in the world who don't have anything to do with the industry in which I work. I could be talking to a friend who, goes through a divorce and, eventually is at a place where they want to talk about it. And, so what happened? And, the guy got into porn and there was a lot of time when he could have been in the bedroom when instead he was at the computer or, and also, when you use your sexual energy in that way, especially the older you get, there's not a lot left for your partner who, is looking for that as a way to bond with you and connect with you. And then, so I think that, I think there are a lot of divorces happening now just because even if it hasn't escalated to the point where the person is destroying every aspect of their lives where it's obvious that they need to go to treatment. There's a lot of damage that gets done that kind of flies under the radar and still enough to destroy a marriage. And sometimes the other partner doesn't even know about it. They just know that they're not sleeping together anymore.
Exactly. And, like you said, even if it doesn't rise to the level of true addiction, it still does cause problems because it is a, proven coping mechanism for so many men out there. And instead of going to the bedroom and having intimate relations where you have to give and take, where you have to be very mentally in the moment with a person who you've done this with thousands of times and how that movie ends, it's a lot easier to look at a computer screen because they're not talking back to you. That pretty girl in the cheerleader outfit doesn't say no. You
Right.
know, the three pretty girls in the cheerleader outfit don't say no. They're not nagging you to take out the trash or pay the bills.
Right.
You know, they allow you to escape to a world that doesn't exist. And, you know, one of the things that I also, try to remind partners is that, it's not just porn addicts who lose a sex drive. You talk to, and I'm sure you talk to anybody with an addiction to pretty much any drug. And you're usually, while there are a few exceptions, sexuality usually drops mightily in these people because they are all about self-soothing.
Right.
And being an addict is a very selfish thing. So to think that, somebody who is being selfish, who is a manipulator, is going to join you in the bedroom and suddenly start giving of themselves, that just doesn't happen. And in the book that Tony and I wrote, we are very quick to tell people we're not urging you to get divorced. We're not urging you to stay together. All we're urging you to do is take a step back and try to analyze the situation and understand where he is or where your partner is in relation to their illness.
The Path to Authenticity is powered by Equivox. For digital marketing and web design services, visit equivox.com. Well, another thing that has come to mind at a couple points during this conversation, there's a book I read a number of years ago. It's probably been out 15 years now, called Wild at Heart. It's a book about manhood, and it's, I'm not always drawn to stuff like this, but it's a little more from the Christian angle. But one of the things that he talks about is when you're using pornography, you're not emotionally invested in that person on the screen. You didn't have to do anything to earn that intimacy. It's, you go there, it's there, they're giving you something that you didn't have to do anything to get. When in real life, you have to cultivate a relationship with another human being in order to achieve intimacy with them. It just completely, so it conditions us to have different expectations when it comes to our sexual experiences.
And in real life, you're never going to find somebody who is as compliant as the person on the computer screen.
Right.
Because they can't say no. They can't say that makes me feel uncomfortable. And with, putting in a couple words into Google, you can literally find anything you want out there these days. And, one of the points that we made in our book is that, the two common male fantasies that come up most often are three-ways and anal sex. And those seem kind of like normal things to most guys these days. Yet if you look at the statistics of women who actually participate in them, it's in the low teens.
Right.
We've created this world of fantasy where we think that, there are these, outlandish behaviors and unorthodox behaviors going on out there as the norm, and they're not. Right. And I think that's also what brings a lot of guys who are searching for something outside of themselves towards pornography, is because it is that ultimate fantasy land. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen a documentary about pornography. I've seen several, and they are among the most unsexy things out there.
Yes.
Because, it's a calculated, well orchestrated maneuvering of people, of men, giving them, what they think that they want, but what's happening on screen isn't even really happening.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, it's just crazy. I mean, I go back to just how much this has all changed.
Well, and right now, the scariest statistic that I throw out at people is one that came out of a study done by the Barna Group in 2017, I think, where they interviewed thousands and thousands of men and women. And in the group of males 18 to 30, 32% said that they believed that they had a problem with pornography or a full-blown addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's 1 out of 3 men under 30 years old
Right.
who granted, it's a self-diagnose, but for 1 out of 3 men to think that they have a problem with pornography who are under 30,
Mm-hmm.
That those men are going to become 40 and then 50 and then 60. And the statistics with women are growing at rapid rates to the point where it's soon going to be, right now it's a little less than 1 out of 5 women under 30 think that they have a problem with pornography. It's going to be up to a quarter within the next decade. If the statistics keep going the way that they are, what does this world look like in 2040 or 2050
Right.
when half the population under 60 years old is hooked on pornography in one way or another?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that world looks like, but it can't be a healthy society.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's, if for no other reason but that it's not reality that people are living in. They're not living in reality when they're so
Right.
consumed with this.
Right. No, it's exactly. And there was a lot of talk right now about, oh my God, what is virtual reality? And, user experience, modules. What's this going to do to pornography? And it's like, pornography has always been about virtual reality.
Right.
From the word go, from when they could paint pornography on cave walls,
Right.
going back to ancient times, it's always been about virtual reality. It's never been about real reality. And that's why it's so, when you think about it, it's so attractive to somebody who has addict behavior,
Mm-hmm.
because being an addict is all about escaping reality. And pornography is by design all about escaping reality.
Yeah. Well, and it also, the person who's not in a relationship, it'll hold you back from going out into the world and putting yourself out there. And it isolates people even more.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's, I make the joke, but if you want to know if porn is real, talk to any pizza delivery guy. He'll tell you just how little sex he's having on the job.
Right.
Because porn would make you think that's all he does.
Right. Right. Oh my gosh. So when it came time for you to arrest the behavior, I mean, I noticed on your website you went to Sante Center out in Texas.
Yep.
And I assume you must have had a good experience there. But what was that experience of change like for you to go from, well, for me, there's a really big transition that takes place from leaving residential treatment to going back out into the world, because,
it's hellish.
In treatment, it's, you're getting all these tools. And a lot of times there's this sense of euphoria because it's a really great experience. You connect with people, which you haven't been doing for a long time. You're eating right. You're exercising. You're healthy, and it feels good. But then what's really difficult is using all those tools.
Yeah.
Actually implementing the change. And so what was that like? I mean, I know what it's like from an alcoholism, from a substance use perspective, but not as much from, what in the industry we refer to as a process addiction.
Right. I had to do this twice. I first went to rehab for alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
And I did 10 weeks in Palm Springs for that in 2014. And then 2015, I did 7 weeks at Sante Center in Texas. And it really is an amazingly transformative experience, especially while you're there. and you're around all these people who, don't know the old problem you and only get to know the new you, and the you who's happy being open and sharing stories and being authentic. And it's, it was my first chance to really be authentic with people. I made, the observation that this was the first time I met a bunch of people I felt like myself around since probably entering middle school and being introduced to a whole new group of friends. And the toughest part, and it was tough at both rehabs, was coming home, because you're this quote unquote new person with a new set of skills, with new tools, ready to take on the world, feeling like you've got this euphoria that you can take on the world, that you're ready for the happiness and the good feeling you had in rehab to permeate your regular real life. But then you get home. And you get home to the same place where all the bad stuff happened, and nothing has really changed. And you get home to all the same people when the bad stuff happened, and none of them have really changed. So really, it's only you, and you almost get this feeling of isolation or feeling of being on an island, because you're this, quote unquote new person, and nobody really sees you as a new person. They see you as the person who went away to get help, and let's cross our fingers he's okay.
Right.
But, it's the same old guy.
Thank God we fixed that.
Yeah, and if you have friends who were using, I think more with the alcohol, they still expect you to in a lot of ways.
Right.
And guess what? HBO is still showing the skin flicks at night. Right. And the internet is still full of pornography. So it's very hard to assimilate back into the world. And what you have to do, what I have had to do in those situations, was to really figure out what the very top level things I needed to do were. I needed to continue to have some exercise time. I would wake up in the morning and walk about a mile, and, walking a mile is not going to, be great for weight loss and cardio and all that. I just needed that time to be with myself and be in my own head and kind of reset for the day. And then it was a matter of making sure that I got into the therapy and could continue to build on those skills and talk about what happened and talk about, where I wanted to go. And it was, cognitive behavioral therapy probably did more for me than anything else, because being a very analytical person who kind of overdoes it with analyzing everything he does anyway, being at a movie and seeing a actress on screen, the old way of me doing things would be like, ooh, I got to remember her name and go check when I get home to see if she was naked in another movie. Instead of doing that, I can say that and then say to myself, okay, well, no, you don't want to do that, because that will bring you to pornography.
Right.
You will not stop at just looking at something she did. You will click on something else on the screen and you'll fall right back into this. And ultimately, it doesn't matter, because she's naked under those clothes, just like you are and just like everybody else is around you. That is not going to help you with anything. And the next time you go to the movies, you think, oh boy, I'd like to see her naked. They think, wait, no, you don't want to see her naked because of all these different reasons.
Right.
And, it's one of these things where it's almost like, muscle memory. You do this enough times early on, I go to the movies now, this doesn't pop into my mind, because I have worked through it with the cognitive behavioral therapy.
You've built the new neuro pathways, is what
exactly. It's muscle memory.
Right.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that, straight out of rehab, I found that the cognitive behavioral therapy was important, because that reminded me the most of rehab, where I was kind of living my good decisions and really, really thinking about them. I still to this day have dreams about drinking, and I haven't had a drop in almost 6 years. It's nothing that's ever going to completely go away, but you figure out what recovery means to you. And, you talked a little bit earlier about people who are very strict with the 12 steps, or you have to do it this way or have to do it that way. And I think that's one of the problems in the recovery community, is that everybody thinks their way is the way.
Right.
And, I did 12 steps in Alcoholics Anonymous for probably about 9 months. I did about 6 months with Sex Addicts Anonymous, and I got out of the programs what I personally, with my personality type, was going to get out of them. Mm-hmm. And, I prefer doing a lot of writing and doing a lot of communicating like I'm doing with you now. Right now, this interview we're doing is part of my recovery. Mm-hmm. It's keeping what I need to do top of mind. And that's what everybody out of rehab really has to figure out, is their individual path, and not worry about necessarily what a template was for somebody else. You need to find for yourself how you're going to stay sober, no matter what the substance or behavior, because that's really the most important thing for your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you about, I'm a 12-step guy. The going through that process changed the course of my life. I never knew true happiness until I went through that experience. It changed everything. And like on here, I follow the 12 traditions, so I don't identify a particular, any organization that I associate myself with, because that's not what you're supposed to do. But I practice the 12 steps. But, there are reasons why that worked for me. It had to do with the way I was brought up, and, that tough, this is what you need to do this, and I don't want to hear about it. Just do it. I was a kid who was going to do that. A lot of young adults now aren't. They're just not gonna take orders from people.
Right.
And they're going to question everything. And I don't think there's really anything wrong with that. And I think one of the things that I've really tried to do in my career, and I write too, and part of what I've tried to do, and with this is, all these concepts are really, really useful. But unfortunately, where we are in our culture with the 12 steps, there are a fair number of people out there that just don't want to hear anything about it for whatever reason. And It may be because somebody tried to cram something down their throat or whatever, or they may just, with young guys, what I talk about is, okay, so, they're leaving a frat house. They're going to treatment. They're coming to live in a halfway house. They're now are we supposed to expect them to want to create a life in AA and be in the back of the room with the guys smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee and trade that for the frat? Nobody wants to do that.
No, that doesn't sound fun at all.
And the important thing is to acknowledge that nobody ever wants to do this. But that doesn't mean you can't find a way to make this work for you. But that's what it's about, and I think by and large, when you mention that, my way is the way, this whole frame of mind that my way is the way, and if you're not doing it my way, you're doing it the wrong way. That just doesn't work for everybody. It just doesn't. And who am I to say what really is going to work for Josh?
Right.
Who am I to say? And like, I have a client, I do some coaching too. And I've talked to him about this. He had some experience in AA, was sober for 7 or 8 years, and, ultimately stopped coming around for whatever reason. And, he had a couple periods like this, and then eventually, descended back down, picked up something else, and boom, he's lost for 4 years. And he finds me and he's telling me about what's going on with him, and I'm listening to him, and I knew I could tell this guy to go get a meeting list, and he needs to go to get a sponsor, and he needs to go to an AA meeting every single day. I could tell him that. He's not going to do it. He's not going to do it. And he's going to keep doing what he's doing. But if I spend some time with him and listen to him and help him see how he can benefit from that 12-step program, or maybe another 12-step program, but kind of support him until he's actually ready to do it, and and just support him. And you know what? He's doing fine. It's been months now. And eventually when he was ready, and what I stressed with him is you need to find a connection with other people. We need other people to support us. So whether that's, in AA or in refuge recovery or smart recovery or whatever the hell it is where you're going to feel comfortable, find what works for you. You have to find, and it's about what do you want? And let's get sober long enough to figure out what you really need to work on.
Right.
And you know what? I mean, I feel really good about that because I know like he could have ended up in front of a lot of other people and he'd be out there right now because, they didn't have the patience or the open-mindedness to meet him where he's at and support him through it and guide him on his own path instead of telling him he's wrong if he doesn't want to take mine.
Well, and I have to say is I found the 12-step experience to be so much more enriching in larger cities where there were different types of people, different types of thinking. I'm in rural Maine,
right.
and this is where Puritanism, basically started. And there's a whole lot of that. You have to do it this way.
Right.
And if you're not suffering, and we're not going to talk about our feelings, we're just going to stop using. And it's like, well, I think we're supposed to talk about our feelings to actually get better. That's what I learned in California or Texas or other places that I've gone to meetings. And I think that there are different 12-step cultures. And I probably, if I was living in LA or Palm Springs or Dallas, I think I'd probably still be part of that culture.
Yeah.
But I couldn't find it up here. And with Sex Addicts Anonymous, what was most troubling is that in Maine, there are 5 meetings a week.
Right.
And there's only one within 30 miles of my house.
Right.
And when I went to that meeting, it wasn't like the ones I went to in Dallas, where there was real healing and fellowship. What I went to was a bunch of men sitting around complaining about their wives. That because I don't think that whoever started that group, I don't know that they had proper training. Right. Or they knew what was supposed to really be happening. So I sat there watching a bunch of guys, to my opinion at least, feeling like they were playing SAA rather than really doing it.
Right.
And I recognized almost right away I was not going to get anything out of this, which, because of where I live, sucks. And the one thing that I did learn in a strange way when I was out in Palm Springs was that I had a friend who several times brought me to the Betty Ford Center, where he went to his Cocaine Anonymous meetings.
Right.
And I found the Cocaine Anonymous meetings to be the best 12-step experience I've ever had. It was like being at a Rocky Horror Picture Show screening. People were having fun. They were supporting each other. This was my kind of crowd.
Right.
And I went to that probably 4 or 5 times. I have done cocaine a total of 0 times in my life.
Right.
But I have felt so much part of that fellowship because they were there to support each other. And that's really what it was about. Right. And, it's unfortunate that sometimes, circumstances dictate you're in a place that you just don't get what you need. So for me, and if anybody else is in a similar boat that I was, you have to find a different way. You can't just say 12 steps is it. And since it doesn't work for me around here, I guess I'm done. Have to find other ways. And I find a lot of that fellowship online in online communities. Talking to guys and helping them out there. I find a lot of fellowship through my website of helping people that way. It really does come down to finding other people who need help, who have the similar thing that you have, and helping them. I think that's just about the biggest key for long-term sobriety.
Well, and it's also, especially, we want to feel connected. So people in your reference group, and I'm glad you brought up the geography aspect, because that's something that's really important for people to understand when they're going through all this. And like you, I mean, it's not terribly rural where I grew up, but I grew up in central Indiana. It was a factory town. There were probably 15 AA meetings a week in a town of 50,000.
Yeah.
And, they were good people, nice people. I mean, but they weren't my people.
Right.
And, I've talked to other people who've gone to meetings there and the rooms are full of smoke and all that. And I'm not judging you, but that's not what I want. I mean, I smoked for a long time. I mean, I quit when I was, 6 or 7 years sober, but, and that's now here where I live in Palm Beach County. I had a sister down here who 12-stepped me and got me into treatment down here when I was 23. And part of the lure was there's 500 meetings a week in Palm Beach County.
Yeah.
It's impossible to not find one that works for you unless you're not looking. And I could find my people. I could. And now as someone in, long-term sobriety, I can also find my people and other 12-step fellowships where we're going deeper, where we're not just talking about why we drank or what happened when we drank or how grateful we are. It's, and, there's a lot of support, and it's not like that everywhere. And I've been to meetings in Palm Springs. I've been not to Dallas, but other parts of Texas, and, and it's really, all the fellowships are a little different everywhere. We have in this area some pockets of Cocaine and Anonymous that's really good. By and large, Narcotics Anonymous isn't as good here as it is in other places. Now, when I say good, I mean, in my mind, if you're somebody who needs help, there's not really any such thing as a bad meeting. But once you get a head of steam and you're doing this thing, I mean, it kind of changes. You're looking for something when you're in the maintenance stage of change. You're looking for something that's going to sustain you, and where, it's actually practical to think, I'm going to keep doing this. And for you, like, obviously it didn't make sense. And so you went out and you found other ways. And a key lesson I learned early on, just from watching people who worked at the treatment facility where I went, they were still working on themselves 20, 30 years later. They were still changing. They were still engaged. And a lot of times it was the 12-step community, but they were going deeper and deeper. They weren't stopping. And it just kind of clicked. This isn't going to end. If I really want to get better, I have to keep getting better. And so, I mean, to me, it's just about continuing to improve as a human being.
Well, that's it. It's self-improvement, and there is no finish line.
Right.
If you reach a finish line, that means you stop moving. It means you stop developing. Mm-hmm. And that's just, tragic that, you're given this one life, and you can make so much of it. You can touch so many other people's lives. You can do so much good. Even if you did spend decades in the beginning making horrible mistakes, that, there is no finish line. It is about always moving forward. And for myself, that's a lot of the advocacy of talking about porn addiction, is that let's see if I can help create a few less addicts, if I can help, have a few households be a little bit better off than they were, then, I did some good in this world while I was here.
Right. Okay. So one more thing I want to ask you before we wrap this thing up, before we get to the last question. as I'm listening, I'm wondering, you're self-described pornography addiction expert. What are the implications, do you think, of shame in all this? Because 30 years ago, I mean, to have a Playboy, I mean, there's a lot of shame attached to that. I mean, you hid them, and then also, how do you think shame affects the biochemical process in engaging in the addiction? And then, where do we stand with shame as it relates to pornography now? What would you say?
I'd say I wish we had 2 more hours. Uh, ultimately, I mean, to shame, and I know that there are so many fine definitions of the difference between shame and embarrassment. That to me, shame is about fear of your isolation and fear of people recognizing your isolation, that you're different, that you have something to feel bad about.
Mm-hmm.
When to take, for instance, pornography addiction, I think the shame that comes from it is multi-layered. Number one, that I'm looking at this stuff that nobody else is looking at. Well, statistics say actually almost everybody else is looking at it. You're far more in the norm if you're looking at pornography and you're under 50 years old than if you're not.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's the next step is, well, why does anybody look at pornography? Usually there's an activity that goes along with it.
Right.
Oh,
right,
masturbating.
Right.
Well, nobody wants to talk about that.
Right.
And nobody wants to talk about the content of what they're masturbating to. There were people who would, probably take a bullet before they show you what they were looking at.
Right.
And so there's that huge element of shame around it, of I am by myself on this island, this somehow broken person. And really, it's just we're all these little broken people walking around.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't understand the neurochemical pathways with shame as I probably should. But it's the driver, it's the driver for I think especially a lot of these process addictions,
Mm-hmm.
is because, we feel shame somehow in our lives. So we go partake in activity that only heaps more shame on top of
Right.
it. It's really counterintuitive when you think
Mm-hmm.
about it. And I had a conversation with a gambling addict not too long ago who talked about how she would be walking into the casino feeling shame build up. She would
Mm-hmm.
feel a hit of shame with that first bet, a hit of shame when she increased the bet. Whether she won or lost, walking out of the casino, she felt shame because she
Mm-hmm.
was going to have to tell people where she was or lie about it.
Right.
And, shame is the central part, I think, of really of addiction and of these process addictions. Because we feel so alone, and it goes back to
Mm-hmm.
that fellowship thing. I think that I'm the first porn addict a lot of porn addicts talk to when they find me online.
Mm-hmm.
And you can just feel this weight coming off their shoulders when you're
Right.
talking to them, because I'm not judging them. I don't
Right.
care what they were looking at. I'm not, judging them as people for what they were looking at. I'm creating a safe environment for them to talk about it. And that's where you see that shame lifted.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what needs to happen more and more, is that we need to create safe environments
Mm-hmm.
for people to, talk about what they were doing, to have these fellowships,
Mm-hmm.
because though feeling safe, feeling loved, well, that defeats shame every day of the week.
Well, when I asked what you thought about the biochemical aspect, I mean, what I was really getting at, and you've expressed it as a hit of shame very accurately, I think, because the other thing about shame is that it also is a distraction. Because we do get that hit. It is an overwhelming feeling that's distracting us from whatever it is that's going on beneath the surface. That's what we really need to be addressing. So even
Absolutely.
that side of it becomes part of the addictive process, the distraction.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating stuff. So if you could go back at some point in your life, the younger Josh, and give him a bit of wisdom, at what point in your life would that be, and what would you say to him?
This is going to sound a little bit flippant, but I would go back to myself about 2 weeks ago and say to not have the sushi that made me so ill. And the reason I got sick. I don't know what the problem was with it. And maybe it wasn't the sushi, but I got very ill after having sushi 2 weeks ago. And I only say this because I look at where my life is now. And I wish I had more money, and I wish that, things were easier for me. I wish that I hadn't had these addictions. But my relationship with my wife and children right now is how I think it's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. It's a relationship I never felt like I had with my family growing up. It's a relationship I didn't have with my wife and kids at the early part of our marriage or when they were younger. And I wouldn't want to lose that. And knowing how the space-time continuum works, I would be afraid that I'd somehow wreck what I have right now. And that even though maybe I would have had easier times in certain aspects, I wouldn't be as happy and content as I am now. And I for all the stress I have to deal with now and different things in my life, I'm pretty good right now, and I'm pretty happy, and I'm probably happier than I ever have been. And the other factor is I know who I was when I was younger. I could give myself the secret to curing cancer, and I would somehow, be deviant and throw it away or do something stupid with it. So I don't think there's telling the younger me anything. Because I wouldn't listen anyway. I'm really happy with where I am today. And if it took all of these strange, wonderful, horrible experiences to get to where I am today, I'm cool with that. Mm-hmm. And for me to be cool with who I am and where I am, so much of my life I wasn't that. So, I'd tell myself to keep moving forward and stay away from bad sushi.
Yeah, well, that's great. I love that because I interviewed someone a couple nights ago, and, I've just kind of implemented this feature, trying to consistently ask a couple questions, and a couple times I had done it and gotten very similar answers, and also similar answers to one I might give if I was posed that question. So I was kind of wondering, man, am I going to is everybody going to end up saying the same thing here? And obviously not, because that's a much different answer than I've gotten before. And I love it. For the most part in my life, I feel the same way. There are a couple things I wish I had done more, mostly to enjoy myself as a kid. But yeah, it even hit me, I'm a divorcee, and it hit me, I don't know, probably about a year ago now. I mean, it's a terrible thing to go through in life. Nobody ever wishes it on anyone. I'm a father too, and I hated taking my son through that. But as a human being, I'm so much better now than I was before I went through that. And on some level, I am happy I went through that, which sounds a little crazy to some people, but it's true, with this, our get past, if we let it and we learn from it, it shapes us into better people. And I'm pretty happy right now. So I'm with you.
Yeah. Well, tell you a really fast story. A couple months ago, my wife took a day off from work. She and I went to a county fair, 50 miles from us, and we had a great time there, bought maple syrup and pet the cows and all that stuff. And we're driving home, and she said to me, I've always loved you, obviously, but for the last few years, I really like you. And that to me was like, that was, if there was a finish line in recovery, that's close to it, because, I understand exactly what she means, because, I loved her and I loved my kids, and I would say that I'd loved my life, but I like it all now. Right. And I think a lot of times liking things is even more important than loving it.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a pleasure. I'm glad we did this. And, I feel like we should try to do this again sometime and kind of continue the conversation. And I just, I hope we can stay in touch, and I'd definitely love to talk to you more about writing. And, I have some journalism experience too from years ago. And, I think philosophically we're kind of in the same place with all this stuff. And it's just been a really nice conversation, Josh. Thank you.
Absolutely. I've enjoyed it myself too. And that's, like I say, this process is part of my recovery because I get to meet new people. And with a lot of them, I do continue relationships after this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a different life than I had 10 years ago. And it's such a better life. So I do hope we can continue on.
For me, ultimately, in my life, once I made a commitment to myself to change and to be better and to, helping people is a big part of that commitment. And the further along I get down the path, it becomes what is the more effective way that I can do that. And that's really why I'm here on this podcast. And I love that you are here because there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that somebody's going to hear this. And it's, there's a pretty good chance it could change the course in somebody's life. And if it does with one human being, then man, it's definitely worth having this conversation with you. So thank you.
I agree 100%. Thank you for having me.
Just the product of some bad seeds.
Thanks for listening to The Path to Authenticity. If you'd like to learn more about our guest, you can find links in the show notes or visit our website at thepathtooauthenticity.com. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, if you have a suggestion for a topic, or you know someone who would make a great guest, email the show at thepathtooauthenticity@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. If you know someone else who would enjoy the show, or even just a particular episode, please share it with them. Every little bit helps. If you're not already a subscriber, please consider becoming one wherever it is you choose to listen. You can find the show on Patreon, where by becoming a patron, you can hear episodes before they're released publicly. You can gain access to supplemental content. There are other benefits in the various tiers. Visit patreon.com/thepathtooauthenticity. Join our Facebook community or follow the show on Instagram, both at The Path to Authenticity. We also have a YouTube channel. You can connect with us on Twitter or Pinterest. To hear the songs from this and every episode, you can find the Path to Authenticity playlist on Spotify. Obviously, there are a lot of ways you could be spending your time, so I appreciate you spending some of it here with me. I'm Tom Gentry. Thanks for listening. Be nice.
You did great, honey.